I hope you all are healthy and safe, that good Mother's Day. In terms of the Jewish calendar, tonight marks the start of Lag BaOmer, which is that joyous break in the calendar and the cycle from the second night of Pesach to Shavuot, a time of celebration, break in the traditional mourning period.
Cutting of hair.
And then on, oh yes, Terry just reminded me it's time for cutting of hair. So those of you who have not been to the beauty parlor or the barber shop, stay away, but you might find somebody who could take care of your hair. Terry and I have been doing that for ourselves. And Thursday, coincidentally, is the 72nd anniversary of the establishment of the Jewish state by the secular calendar, the Gregorian calendar, and that would be May 14. Also on calendar next Monday, Rabbi Ethan Prosnit, our senior rabbi designate, will be joining on Lunch and Learn. Again, excuse me, just a little water. Will be joining us for discussion on our future and vision. Particularly, I'll be asking Rabbi Prosnit about his vision for the future of our wonderful Temple Emanu-El. I was reading a powerful editorial by the editorial board of the Times, New York Times, this morning on the future of our cities, and I was struck by a passage I want to share with you today. I commend that editorial to you. The nature of a nation is that we are bound together in a community of shared obligation, purpose, and opportunity. Bound together in a community of shared obligation, purpose, and opportunity. I read that and thought about Israel, shared obligation, purpose, and opportunity. And I also thought about, beyond our United States, I thought about our community, our synagogue community, and the sharing that we have through this, not only through this webinar, but through our entire synagogue community and what we've meant to each other during these difficult and challenging months. Rabbi Yoffie needs no introduction for almost all of you, but I will say that he is our cherished friend, my esteemed colleague, member of our synagogue for 37 years, Eric, and that's a long time, and been wonderful for us. Eric was executive director of ARTSA starting in 1983, and then moved on to become the president of the Union Reform Judaism in 1992. He's now the president emeritus, and is a columnist for the Israeli daily Haaretz. And if don't receive his column, that can certainly be arranged. Can be in touch, I think, with Eric directly with you, or what's the best?
Just go to ericyoffie.com and you can sign up right there.
Excellent. ericyoffie.com. Excellent. Free of charge, right?
Free of charge.
Free of charge. Eric, this is probably your first teaching, public teaching moment since our dear Amy left us. I believe certainly here at the Temple, and probably in general. And I just want to say that there are a lot of people on this call who care about you and love Amy and counted her as a dear friend. We're thinking of her at this time, and on behalf of everybody on the call, sending you our sympathy and our support. And we're we're grateful that your family is with you, has been with you, right? Just on a personal note, you might want to share that who's been living with you?
And my daughter and her husband and their son, my grandson, are been living with me for the last 5 weeks or so, which is wonderful. Certainly wonderful for me, hopefully for them as well.
Right, right. So thank you, Eric, for being with us. We have a record number of people on our call. I show 86 computers. Jackie was telling me it was close to 100 computers, which probably means 150 or more people on the call, which is wonderful. So Eric, after 3 elections, there's a coalition agreement of sorts. Tell us something about what this government's going to look like, and this agreement, and perhaps the role of the Supreme Court in the government. What does it look like to you?
Well, it's been a chaotic time, even by Israeli standards, over the course of the last year. Not 1 election, not 2 elections, but 3 elections. Throughout those elections, it seems as if, certainly for the first 2 and even for the third, that no one would be able to put together a stable ruling coalition. In Israel, of course, you don't vote for the person, you vote for the party. So we have the parties of the right, the Likud party, led by Bibi Netanyahu being the major force there. We have the parties of the center and the left, with blue and white being the lead party, which is led by Benny Gantz, a former Israeli chief of staff. Now, even though the elections are among parties, the focus of all 3 of those elections wasn't on party issues. The focus of all 3 of those elections was yes, Bibi, never Bibi. That was, in essence, and sometimes explicitly, the campaign slogan, more so as time went on. So why this focus, this obsession with Bibi Netanyahu? Some of it is Bibi fatigue. He's been prime minister altogether for 14 years, 11 years in a row, longest serving prime minister in Israel history. Some people say that's too long for anybody. There are those in the center and the left who feel he's becoming more autocratic and demagogic as time goes on. And there are those on the right who feel the opposite, that in fact it's the deep state, the bureaucracy and the elites that are trying to push him out and get rid of him. A major factor in the course of these 3 campaigns has been the 3 criminal indictments that Bibi faces. We won't go into the specifics here, discussed those before. And there are many people in Israel who felt that criminal indictments really disqualified him as a candidate for prime minister, while his supporters said that all of those charges were politically motivated and there really wasn't much to them. Now, the truth is, the focus on Bibi as opposed to other things really is not good for Israel. That's my view. There was remarkably little discussion during these 3 campaigns over a year on the substantive issues that Israel faces. Questions of peace and settlements and annexations, questions of domestic policy, healthcare system, transportation system, and educational system, and of course the religious issues that are important to us and are important to Israelis. It's not that they didn't come up, they did come up, but they were all overshadowed by this talk about do we want Bibi or don't we? But in all 3 elections, what ended up happening is the 2 blocs basically came out even. I mean, that's basically what happened. And to have a stable government, which is, there are 120 Knesset members, so a stable government really requires about 65. Nobody was able to do that. Now, in this third election, what happened was the president of Israel, after an election, goes to the heads of the parties and says, who is it that you recommend should be prime minister? And so after the third election, President Rivlin did that, and parties with 61 Knesset members, a very thin majority, recommended that Gantz should be prime minister. So it seemed that after all of this, because normally when a president calls upon someone to form a government, or she, that person is able to do so. And Benny Gantz set out, he had 3 weeks to form a government. Most people felt that one way or another he would do it, but he didn't do it. He did not succeed. So why did he not succeed? Because the 61 Knesset members and the various parties that supported him ranged from the very left, meaning the Arab parties, to some very conservative members of his own party, Blue and White. And there was really a tremendous difference between these parties of the right and left in terms of where they stood. And ultimately, although they all recommended Gantz, so they all wanted him as prime minister, they all in theory opposed Bibi as prime minister, they could not ultimately agree on a platform and an approach that would make it possible for them to form a government and for Gantz to become prime minister. So after Gantz failed, Bibi got his turn. Now, as I mentioned, he had only 59 mandates to begin with, which is one short of a majority. So how did we get to a situation where he, as of Wednesday, is going to be the next prime minister? How did he form a government? Well, there were some defections from Blue and White, from some of those more conservative Knesset members. There were some defections from Labor, from the Labor Party, the Socialist Labor Party that was the dominant party in Israel for most of its history. Some of them defected, in fact, to the other side, said they'd support Bibi. There was a general feeling in Israel that a fourth election is just too much. How can you, what kind of stable and sane democratic country has 4 elections and no permanent governor in the course of a 14 or 15-month period? And then the final factor here was, of course, the coronavirus. That as Bibi was trying to put together a government and get together a majority out of the 120 Knesset members, the pandemic hit. And this created an emergency situation there, as it did here and as it has in countries throughout the world. So Gantz agreed that he would serve together with Bibi in what he said was an emergency government. Bibi would serve the first 18 months. He would then serve 18 months after that. Now, remember, he had gone through 3 election campaigns in which he had said specifically, emphatically, repeatedly, he would never serve under a prime minister who had been indicted for serious crimes, which, of course, is Bibi's situation. But after saying that, he changed his position. And he said, look, we have an emergency now. This emergency justifies a change by me. It justifies my willingness to go back on that commitment because, we have to deal with a virus. We have to deal with it as a united people. We can't go to a 4th election under these circumstances. Now, when he did that, when Gantz said, I will serve with Bibi in a rotation deal, he'll be prime minister first and then me, half of his own party, Blue and White, broke away. Half of the Knesset members left Blue and White. They formed a new party. And what they said was, we made a promise. We intended to keep it. Our whole platform, our whole campaign, again, was based on this notion we would not serve under an indicted prime minister. To do so now is impossible.
He was left with 15, right? 15.
Yes, 15 were left with Gantz. 16 broke away.
No.
And so they said, well, yes, it's true there's an emergency, but he said, Bibi can't be, now the dissident said, Bibi can't be trusted anyway, He's going to promise you a deal, that there's going to be a rotation, but before you ever get to be prime minister, he'll find an excuse to bring down the government and call an election. Now, was Gantz right in doing what he did? And all of Israel, for the last couple of weeks, has been debating this. Everybody who knows Israelis, know that they feel very intensely on this one side or another. And I know people on both sides of the argument. Was Gantz right? I'm not a big fan of Bibi Netanyahu, as many of you know from my talks over the years. In this particular case, I'm not sure that he had a choice. I really don't know that, given the virus and the threat that it posed, and we'll talk about that, that going to a fourth election and leaving Israel without really a functioning government, I don't know that that was an option. So I'm sympathetic to some degree to Gantz. Whether or not he's right, obviously, depends on your outlook.
Did he give away the store, Eric?
All right, now we come to the question of when they actually formed a government and the specifics were worked out in terms of who got what.
No.
It's interesting, a little bit scary. What kind of a government was formed? Of course, the government is supposed to be sworn in on Wednesday. Hasn't actually been sworn in yet, so there could be last-minute changes. But this is what we know. Now, when they're doing the negotiating, Bibi had the upper hand because he still had 36 Knesset members, but as Rabbi Kroloff indicated, Gantz, who had started with 31, all of a sudden had 15. So Netanyahu was in a place to dictate terms more so than was Gantz, but still Gantz had some clout, because Israel is going to face some very tough problems in the months ahead. And the truth of the matter is, Bibi did not want to take on those problems only with the parties of the right, parties, the Likud and parties farther to the right. He wanted someone to share the responsibility and, if need be, to share the blame. So he very much, even if he could have put together a narrow majority, he very much wanted a wider government and some centrist party members to be part of the deal. But in any case, the rotation deal they worked out is bizarre, problematic. It's a deal that, on the face of it, makes no sense. Now, usually there have been rotations in Israel's history before, and usually it's pretty straightforward. You have two parties, each has a leader. One leader is prime minister, usually for 2 years, and then after the other one is his deputy, and then after 2 years you switch, and the other party's leader becomes prime minister and with a deputy. That's not the deal here. The deal here is, I'm sure you've read this, get ready for it. There will be two prime ministers. There'll be the actual prime minister, initially Bibi, and then what is called the alternate prime minister, Rosh HaMemshala Chilufi. Bibi will serve for 18 months initially, with Gantz being the alternate prime minister. Bibi absolutely insisted on going first. Then they'll switch. Gantz will become prime minister. Bibi will be the alternate prime minister. And then 9 more months for Bibi. And then after that, 9 more months for Gantz. Now, what democratic country in the world has 2 prime ministers? And the answer is none. None. There's no such thing anywhere. Now, this was Bibi's idea, and then what is it about? And everyone knows what it's about. It's all about Bibi's criminal trial, which starts in 2 weeks on May 24th. He feels that he has a better chance of being acquitted or of winning an appeal if he is the prime minister of Israel. Now, if he's found guilty, he'll have to step down. And his reasoning is that, and it makes some sense here from his perspective, is that a judge or a group of judges will be reluctant to overturn the results of an election by forcing a prime minister elected by Israel's democratic system to leave office. Now, the trial could take a long time. Under the deal, Bibi's guaranteed to be in office for 18 months. So even if the trial were to run that long or longer, he will still be prime minister. And if he's convicted, the appeals process could easily take a year or more. So again, if that happens, and the 18 months is up, he will be alternate prime minister. In other words, he'll still be prime minister, at least of the sort, and not simply a cabinet member or a member of Knesset. So either way, he feels he's protected and has maximum leverage against the judicial system.
But if he's found guilty, the alternate prime minister position would not protect him, right? If he's found
Unclear.
guilty.
Unclear.
Okay.
He is if he is the alternate prime minister, and he is found guilty, the question is, if you're a member of the cabinet and you are found guilty of a crime, you need to step down.
Right.
If you're prime minister and you're found guilty of a crime under existing Israeli law, you are not obligated to step down. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't. When Olmert was found guilty of a crime and he was the sitting prime minister, his party forced him to step down, but he didn't have to. He didn't have to. So if Bibi is found guilty or is found guilty on appeal, because certainly there would be an appeal,
right.
And he is alternate prime minister, his claim is alternate prime minister is a form of being prime minister.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, I can remain in office. But of course, this is an unprecedented situation. Will the court go along, or will they say there's no such thing really as an alternate prime minister? You're simply a cabinet minister like anybody else, and therefore you would have to step down. And that is a matter that the court has yet to decide. When this whole deal came up before the court just last week, they were asked the question, having two prime ministers, is that constitutional? And it also raised the question of, can somebody who is under criminal indictment form a government to begin with? And the court decided, interestingly, by a vote of 11-0, not to intervene. It said, in essence, this is a problem, not in essence, it said very specifically, this is a very problematic deal for a democratic government. There are political problems with it. There are ethical problems with it. They said, the truth is, it's not really our job to solve those problems. Our job is to deal with legal issues. And legally, at this point, we don't see any basis in existing Israeli law to intervene. But still, the court left open the possibility that this whole matter could be revisited later. So if Bibi is found guilty, and at that point he's alternate prime minister, there's no question somebody would bring that to the court.
Right.
And the court, at least in theory, at that point could decide that he would have to step down from that position. But as you can hear, what a mess! This is really no way for a democratic government, particularly at a difficult period, to run its affairs. On the other hand, the alternative was another election or the caretaker government that we've had for the last year. So there were no good options here. And right now, this is where we're at. This government will presumably be sworn in on Wednesday. And for now, it has the approval of Israel's Supreme Court.
You've helped to clarify somewhat a mess. That's quite an accomplishment. Before we go on to the next subject, I just want to remind folks on the webinar that the chat room is available for questions, and we'll be turning to it in 15 or so minutes. Let's go to the coronavirus in Israel. The impression is, news reports, that Israel's handled it quite well. Numbers of deaths are low. Numbers of cases are low. Per capita figures are low. Would you agree that it's been well handled?
Well, it's on a certain level, yes, on a certain level, no. Let me explain. The deaths the death total is fewer than 250. That's quite extraordinary.
It is.
You have to see it in comparative terms. Generally speaking, the way this is being measured around the world is the deaths per million. For Israel, the rate is 27 deaths per million in the population, 27. In the United States, the rate of deaths per million is 213.
Right. It's almost 10 times.
So that's a huge difference. Most Israelis feel that it's been handled well. Prime Minister Netanyahu took charge of this almost immediately. Like President Trump, he personally did nightly briefings. They included everything from sort of general reports on the virus and the situation to literally personal demonstrations about how you put on the mask. Famous, in Israel, some people thought this was funny. Some people thought it was important. Bibi would put on the mask and that this is how we do it, and make sure you're covering, your nose and that kind of thing. But the point is that unlike President Trump, he relied heavily on the best scientific and medical advice.
Right.
He put together a team that included the research and development arm of the Israeli army. There's just an article in the Times about this. I thought it was very, very well done. He also brought in the representatives of Israel's top high-tech firms, and they formed a working team. In the United States, if you remember, the president put together a team and he announced on TV, and the people who were on the team didn't even know that they were on it until they heard it on TV. It's not the way that Israel did it. Israel said, we need a group of people who are cooperating closely, who have the expertise, and who are going to work on this. And responding to the advice he got, Netanyahu, who was, again, head of a caretaker government at that point, closed down Israel almost immediately. He required people coming into the country to go into quarantine for 2 weeks. In practical terms, that meant the end of tourism, which is, of course, a vital part of Israel's economy.
Israel basically has one entry point, Ben Gurion Airport,
Right.
Essentially, with few exceptions.
And if
Made it easier.
Right. And if you have to come in and spend 2 weeks in a hotel in quarantine, you're there on a 10-day trip or a 2-week trip. I mean, obviously, you don't have much incentive to go. But Netanyahu saw that there was really no choice. Israel is a small country, has a population that's not all that much larger than the population of greater New York City area. It's a geographic area about the size of New Jersey. So imagine if Israel had been hit as hard as the New York City area had been hit. The result would have been national catastrophe. And Israel, remember, is a country still at war with many of its neighbors. It would have been vulnerable to attack and disaster. Now, was Netanyahu being an opportunist here? The answer is, of course he was. But all politicians, are opportunists, essentially by definition. When he was doing this, he hadn't yet formed a government. He was facing criminal indictments. He wanted to send a message to Benny Gantz, who hadn't decided yet that Israel needed a unity government that Netanyahu would lead. He wanted to send a message to the judicial system that Israel needs a decisive prime minister who should not be distracted from his official duties by criminal indictments and so on, certainly shouldn't be removed from office. So he had other motives. It doesn't make any difference really in this sense what his motives were. He acted quickly and decisively on the medical front with results that to date at least have been very positive. Israel starting to open up its economy. We'll see what happens with that. But still, we should talk about the things he did not do. He did not act decisively enough when it came to the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, particularly in Bnei Brak, which is a suburb of Tel Aviv, also in Jerusalem, other areas. They were slow to obey government social distancing requirements in Israel, as they were here in the States and in the New York area. And the truth is, this was purely a political matter. It was a mistake. The rabbis, in most cases, who really control what happens in that sector, did not give clear instructions that the law was to be obeyed. And initially, Netanyahu was reluctant to put pressure on them. He gave in to the pressure, but then he came around. I mean, he understood based on what was happening and the advice that he was getting that that he simply couldn't permit that to happen, or again, the results would have been disastrous. The problem is the decisiveness that he showed in the public health realm, he really did not show in the economic realm. If you look at the polls, it's very interesting. He has very good polls on when Israelis are asked, how did he do in dealing with the virus? Very positive polls. If you ask, how did he do in dealing with the economy, the polls are pretty negative. Now, these two things are related, and it may be that the Israelis here are being somewhat unfair to him. It's not so easy to deal with both at the same time. But the truth is, he really did not have a good economic team in place in the way that he had a good medical team in place. And there are a variety of reasons for that, having to do with the caretaker government. And he had an economics minister who was on his way out and wasn't really paying attention. But the point is, Israel has 1 million unemployed people now. Now, Israel, remember, is a country of, somewhat, 8.5 to 9 million people. 1 million unemployed Israelis is a very, very large number. Small businesses were particularly hard hit. There was a stimulus bill that was passed, but many of the small businesses in Israel have been unable to access those funds for reasons having to do with bureaucracy and so on. We know something about that here too. And estimates are that as many as 400,000 out of the 1 million people who are unemployed may not get their jobs back. So, and it really isn't clear at this stage that there's a plan to deal with this, which is part of the reason, as I indicated, why Bibi was so anxious to have Gantz and his people in the government. He didn't want to face this alone. So economically, Israel's in for some very hard times ahead.
Okay. That's very helpful. Just add in some reading and some correspondence with Israelis. Some feel that the history of compliance by Israelis in national security issues, very rapid response to emergencies, terrorist attacks, and so forth, and responding to government instructions was helpful here in the response to the virus. There's a history of compliance and probably a factor, right?
I think that's true. Virtually everybody in Israel is in the army, has been in the army.
Right.
They know what a national emergency is. And when you have a true national emergency, you have to respond. Members of this team that I mentioned that was put together to deal with the virus talked about the fact we have a military mentality in a certain sense in times of crisis, because that's our history. And we've responded in that way here. So I agree with that. And the results so far have been impressive. Let's hope for the best looking forward.
One more comment, and this is related to a question from Susan Cohen, referring to the New York Times article that some of us read back a while ago about the educational system and the hospital, the healthcare system being in considerable disarray. It's comforting, but a little surprising that Israel was able to respond as effectively as it did, in light of the fact that the healthcare system has been underfunded and is in disarray. Again, someone I was in touch with in Israel shared with me that she thought that while that's all true and very distressing, that the foundations of the health system are there. I'm not exactly sure what she meant, although she indicated that the percentage of medical doctors per capita in the country still is very high, and she found that to be encouraging. But you want to comment on the?
Yeah, I don't agree with it.
Yeah,
with what she's saying. Israel, if you go back 30 or 40 years, had a health system that they were proud of, and that Jews everywhere were proud of. It provided health care free or very inexpensively the entire population, and so on. Now, this is part of the Netanyahu legacy that is not positive. Over the last 10 to 12 years, there's really been a collapse of the healthcare system, and this isn't a subjective matter. The OECD, which is the Organization of Advanced Industrialized Democracies, has done a number of surveys, and they do yearly reports, and the yearly report here talked about the fact that hospital bed availability in Israel is among the lowest in the world for industrialized democracies. Death from infection is the highest by a lot, by a lot. The investment in the health system over the last decade or two, again, is very low, among the worst among industrialized democracies. So, I mean, it's very interesting in terms of the virus. Quick action prevented the hospitals from being overwhelmed. One of the issues that was discussed is, if the hospitals were overwhelmed, not only would they have the problem that any country would have in those circumstances, but the truth is the hospitals, they're simply understaffed and underfunded, and in plain terms, they're not very good. They don't meet the standards of most modern European countries. So the disaster would have been multiplied by a factor of 2 or 3. We should not conclude from the response to the virus that the health system is good. It is not good. And in fact, this is a top priority for this new government. Not only are they going to deal with coronavirus, but are they going to do something about the hospital system and the availability of medical equipment and medical care to the general population. It is true that Israel has a lot of doctors, but doctors in and of themselves, the number of doctors is not necessarily a good measure. And
Susan also asked you, do you anticipate that this 2 prime minister system, the new system, will possibly address education and health issues? Do you see any hope for that?
It really is unclear. I mean, education is another area. I wrote an article about this based on the Times article. You can find it on my website. The education system is also among the worst. The test results for Israeli kids when it came to mathematics, literacy, and so on were terrible. We're terrible. They're at the bottom. That's an embarrassment. We're the people of the book, And the fact that the system has deteriorated the way that it has, is terrible. And here Netanyahu bears responsibility, and we really needed an election campaign to focus on these issues, which we didn't have. But will the new government do better? And the answer is it's unclear. It's really very unclear. There was an ultra-Orthodox minister who had headed up the health ministry. He was not the right person for the job. He is not going to be in that position when I don't think it's clear yet who the health minister is. We're hoping for a better health minister. It's also not clear when I last saw who the education minister is. Right. Will this awkward government and this bizarre, form that it's taken be able to deal with these important substantive issues? Frankly, I just don't know.
Yeah, a question just asked by Lori Goldsmith-Heitner about Gaza, because I think we all anticipated a disaster in the squalid conditions of Gaza in terms of the virus. I don't think there's been an explosion there, has there?
No, there hasn't been.
No.
And Gaza's actually done reasonably well in terms of the health situation. It's very interesting. I mean, they've experienced sort of an economic boom. I don't know if you saw, again, there have been a few articles about this, but because of the need for masks and gowns, yes, and the shortage, they have garment factories in Gaza that can produce those materials and have been able to do so very quickly, both for Israel and for surrounding Arab countries. And the Israelis have wisely, in this case, kind of loosened up the various regulations that might serve as obstacles here to the kind of movement of goods in and out, and even people in and out that normally exist. So all of this is rather encouraging. Whether it will lead to some kind of understanding with Hamas and improvement in the political situation, it's very hard to say.
No. I would imagine that the fact that Gaza is relatively closed society, although there are a lot, they're going in and out some, but relatively closed Gaza, that probably contributed to the low rate of infection.
No question.
Yeah.
Just as in Israel, you don't have people pouring over the borders.
Right.
You don't have open borders. The same is true with Gaza, but of course, Gaza has this, tremendous density of population, which works the other way. But so far, thank goodness, they've escaped serious suffering from the disease. We hope that continues.
Right. Okay. Keep giving us. Well, this is related. Annette Raddick, while we're on the healthcare, does Hadassah have a positive effect? Hadassah Hospital, I assume you're referring to, Annette. Positive effect on the conditions of medical care, or does it need to refocus?
I have to admit, I'm not enough of an expert here. Hadassah Hospital is a wonderful
over your pay grade, huh?
Right, yeah. But I'm assuming they're doing good work and are pushing for the kind of reform. It's not like the hospitals are happy with this situation.
No.
On the contrary, they're very unhappy. I mean, they have patients lined up in the corridors. They have much higher death rates than they want and feel they can tolerate. It's not as if you don't have a medical establishment that's pushing for reform. You do. You just don't have a government that's been responsive in this area. So I'm sure Hadassah's leading the charge, but I don't have too many details.
Right. So there's a lot of talk about annexation. Possibly 1st of July, thereabouts. What's the likelihood of that? What does it mean? How broad, if there is, how wide do you think that will be in the West Bank? Implications? Is it a nail in the coffin of Israeli democracy? How do you see the possibility of annexation playing out?
Well, it's interesting that Bibi's been prime minister a total of 14 years, and for most of those 14 years, he talked little, if at all, about annexing the West Bank or parts of the West Bank. That changed in the last year, and his rhetoric has escalated. Again, there were 3 elections. At the beginning, he was saying, well, maybe we'll annex a few settlements, and then by the second election, he was talking about annexing the Jordan Valley. And by the third election, he was talking about annexing the Jordan Valley and all of the settlements. And now he's talking about annexation of as much as 30% of the West Bank and sort of the key areas throughout the territory. So, the question is, why is he doing this? And why is this happening? One reason, of course, is President Trump, because Trump provides an opportunity. I mean, prior to Trump, it's inconceivable that any Republican or Democratic president would have gone along with any major annexation. The Golan Heights is one thing, but that's not what we're talking about here. And Secretary of State Pompeo said recently, within the last week or two, that the Trump administration will approve of an annexation by Israel if it's consistent with the deal of the century. In other words, if Bibi accepts the deal in principle, and it comes with a map that allows for a lot of annexation. So if Bibi accepts the deal, the Trump administration will go along. And I'm playing on that. Bibi knows that Trump is very dependent on the evangelical vote. The evangelicals will look favorably on annexation. He's given a number of speeches and appeals to evangelical groups in the course of the last few weeks. He knows Trump is vulnerable now. He also knows if Trump loses, the opportunity for annexation will be gone. So he's playing on that. The elections themselves contributed to this. Bibi could not afford to lose any of the settler vote to parties to the right of Likud, and this was a way of shoring up that vote. And also, of course, the indictment. He's indicted on 3 charges. He's has been over the last year especially vulnerable because of these charges, and he sees annexation as a way to rally his base.
How wide a support, Eric, in the general population is there for annexation?
very unclear. Very unclear. The settlers support it. Most Israelis don't talk about it or necessarily think about it. They're not. They don't tend to be terribly unhappy with the status quo. On the other hand, look, if annexation happens, you know what's going to follow. The Europeans are strongly against it. That they will condemn is clear. Will there be trade sanctions? Maybe, because they feel very strongly about this. The European Union is the major trading partner of Israel. Relations with Saudi Arabia and the moderate Arab states would be jeopardized. The Saudis and the Sunni states have been destabilized really by what's going on because of the virus. You have this huge drop in oil prices, and that means their economic situation has been impacted in a major way. And it's very likely they would not react well at all to a controversial Israeli annexation. The annexation could lead to unrest in the West Bank. The PA could sever its ties to Israel. Some people say, well, so what? You know, who cares? But the Palestinian Authority administers the West Bank. They're the ones who do the day-to-day, you know, job of keeping things running. If they don't do it, Israel's going to have to do it. And very important, if there's an annexation, it could undermine the stability of Jordan, which might conceivably break diplomatic relations with Israel. Jordan is already in very bad shape. The Saudis have been unable to help them out because of the economic crisis. Annexation could push the Jordanians over the edge.
That's possibly, the Jordanian issue is possibly potentially the biggest serious result from it. I mean, or in a realistic way, because they are on the edge.
They are on the edge. The two biggest issues, I believe, are you have the Jordanian situation and what might result from that, and then you have in America. Let's put American Jews aside for a minute because Bibi doesn't care much about what American Jews feel. He's giving speeches to evangelicals. He's not giving speeches to American Jews. And but the Democratic Party is a different matter. And Joe Biden has already made a statement on annexation. It was a very good statement. He said, by the way, if he were elected president, he would leave the embassy in Jerusalem, which was interesting. I support that. I think it's the right thing to do. And moving it back would send all kinds of negative signals. So I think he was wise to say that, and we appreciate that in the Jewish community. But he said, look, we support a Jewish and democratic Israel. And annexation would be moving Israel away from a Jewish and democratic model. And so he said, you know, very firmly that we're opposed to that. We don't think it would be wise for Israel to do that. And of course, he's expressing here what consistently has been the policy of the United States government, Republican and Democrat, for 50 years. Even on the right, you know, there was in the op-ed pages of the Times, 3-4 days ago, Daniel Pipes, who's a far right-wing, you know, commentator and analyst and academic and involved in a think tank and you know, a real right-winger, hardliner. He said Israel should not annex the West Bank. That was very interesting to read. And I mean, he said, I thought some terrible things about Israeli Arabs, you know, Arabs who are citizens of Israel. But let's put that aside. Ultimately said, if they do that, if Israel does that, they're going to have to give citizenship to the Arab inhabitants of the annexed territories.
But Eric, if that's, the annexed territories are overwhelmingly Jewish.
They are overwhelmingly Jewish, but not entirely. And there could be as much as several 100,000 Arab West Bank residents who would be included. And, you know, Pipe said Israel does not want or need an additional Arab population. So, you know, well, his words were offensive in some way. The truth is the demographic balance is an important and legitimate issue, and an annexation would impact that demographic balance without question. So this is a very, as you said, it's a hugely important issue. It could impact any kind of peace that might be possible, even in the distant future. My own view is, I'm not sure Bibi's going to do it. There's a lot of activity here. A lot of people are very worried about it. I think it's legitimate for them to be concerned. You don't know, given all the uncertainties and instability. But the truth of the matter is, Netanyahu has succeeded in getting the Palestinian issue off of the international agenda. Who talks about the Palestinians now? Right. No one's talking about it. The international community has other problems right now, and the Palestinians really are not one of them. So why make it the focus of international attention and bring this opprobrium of the entire world down on Israel's head? So it would be smart for Bibi to talk about it and do whatever he has to do with his settler population to explain it, but then not to do anything. That's what I hope will be the outcome, but I'm not sure.
Right. Just final point on that. There's been a bit of a rapprochement with the Gulf states, with the Saudis and with the Gulf states, and that rapprochement, that tiptoeing toward Israel would be badly undercut by such.
No question. And it's been, again, it has been an accomplishment of Netanyahu that he's been able to make these ties, and there's been, on a very, very modest level, a certain amount of joint meetings and so on. That's progress. It's a step forward. We need to welcome it. It has been seriously undermined, and I've said already, by the economic situation and by the tension between. Trump was the big buddy of the Saudis and the Saudi leadership, but now they're throwing threats back and forth at each other because of the oil issue. American oil, is the oil companies are going bankrupt. We're the largest oil producer in the world, but we can't sell our oil now because of the collapse of prices, and they've called upon the Saudis to cut back their production, and they've refused to do so. So all of a sudden, the great buddies are not such great buddies anymore, and this will have an impact on Israel as well. The Saudis won't be looking to do any favors for Israel in order to curry support from Trump, because right now they're not getting along with Trump.
Right. Two interesting, different kinds of questions, but two interesting questions here. Ed Lerner asked, what caused labor to collapse so badly in the last few years? I think they're down to three seats in the Knesset, and this is the party of Ben Gurion and Golda Meir and Shimon Peres.
Look, labor has basically disappeared, and on the one hand, it's a long-term process. I mean, when Bougie Herzog ran against Netanyahu a number of years back, he had a respectable performance. Some people thought he even might win. Mm-hmm. But it's a question that really has a number of answers. The socialist ideology, that was the foundation of Labor Party thinking, has come into disrepute throughout the world, and to some extent within Israel as well. Israel has moved into a more of a centrist capitalist model, for good or for ill, depending on where you are on that. But its distinctive social policies have been largely pushed aside. Labor leadership in the early days rested heavily on certain elite groups, in particular the kibbutzim. The kibbutzim themselves have virtually disappeared from Israel and have ceased to be a factor of importance in Israeli society. Part of it is a leadership issue. Israel had the Israel Labor Party had great leaders. The founding fathers and mothers of Israel all came out of labor. Ben Gurion and Golda Meir and Peres and Rabin were labor figures. In the post-Rabin period, there really hasn't been a single labor leader of truly national stature, let alone international stature. I mean, you know, Peres in his older days was a beloved statesman, was no longer a political factor. You don't have Netanyahu, for good or for ill, is a leader. Labor does not have somebody now who is widely respected as both charismatic and competent. All these factors contribute. It's a great tragedy, I think.
Yes, it is.
A great tragedy.
It is. We miss labor. We miss labor.
We do.
Badly. Eric and I spent a little bit of time with the laborites over the years. We miss them. From Carol Cohen, under this new government, will the ultra-Orthodox still have such a large influence on the government? And what might be the influence of the more liberal groups in the government, to the extent that there are liberal groups?
Look, our hope always as Reform Jews is that you'll get a government without the ultra-Orthodox, and ideally without any Orthodox party at all. And it could have happened. In other words, we could have imagined a scenario here, even as recently as this third election, where such a government might have come into being. Blue and White, before the break, had a very good platform on religious issues, a very good platform. It called for civilian marriage. It called for allowing convenience stores to be open on Shabbat. It called for public transportation on Shabbat. It called for a friendlier conversion system. It called for a restoration of the Kotel deal. It called for a military draft that was more equitable. It didn't essentially exempt virtually all of the Haredim. How many of these things will happen now? And the answer is not one. Not one. What was left of Blue and White, the part that together with Gantz went into the government, was faced with a demand by Netanyahu that the ultra-Orthodox parties remain in control on these matters, and they agreed. They didn't. I'm not sure that they had much of a. I mean, once they decided to go in with half of their original strength, it really wasn't, much of a choice. And so the only bright spot is the culture ministry is going to go to Blue and White, and the culture ministry is important because there is minimal government funding that goes to the Reform and Conservative movement, and it doesn't go through the religious affairs ministry because the Orthodox would never permit that, but it goes through the culture ministry. And so that funding will continue, and maybe it'll be increased a little tiny bit. But for the most part, this is a case of what could have been. Our only consolation is we were close. You had a major party with an excellent religion state platform that almost formed the government. Religious issues have entered the public forum and are debated now by all Israelis. So we have to think that our day will come, but it hasn't come yet.
Yeah. So moving into perhaps our final subject for now, and we still welcome any questions in the chat room if you want to put some out there. But segue just from what you spoke about in terms of our day will come. Talk a little bit about the progress that our movement has made, our movement and the liberal religious streams that would include Masorti, the conservatives, in terms of what kind of progress, how are our synagogues doing, and what's the overall feel there?
Look, the overall picture for us, we have to think of bit by bit building a grassroots movement. That's what's happening on the ground in Israel. So on the one hand, we're encouraged by that. One synagogue at a time, one rabbi at a time. We continue to ordain rabbis. There are well over 100 Israeli ordained rabbis now serving in Israel. So that's something that should motivate us and encourage us. On the other hand, it's not going to change the overall reality in a day. We are active in the political front. We all know who Anat Hoffman is. We have the Religious Action Center. So although we're a small movement, we have a strong voice particularly on religious issues, but on general political issues, because we've built the center in Jerusalem that Reform Jews here have played a major role in supporting. But the larger reality is slow progress on the ground as we build this grassroots presence. And I'll simply conclude by saying I was reading what they've been doing during the course of the virus, and Zoom lectures on Jewish topics, Zoom services, reaching out to members in our own movement and members of the general community, those who are isolated, those who need help, those who need people to shop for them, who need support in a variety of ways. So I say those are the things that we're doing here, but they're especially important in Israel because there aren't other people to do them. Orthodox congregations in Israel are not constructed in that way. They're essentially places where people go to worship. The government pays the salaries of the rabbis. They don't build religious communities. We build religious communities, and their impact during the coronavirus pandemic has really been quite impressive. But it's small. We need to expand that circle. It's going to take us a while to do so, and it's going to require, of course, the help and support of American Jews.
Final word about Religious Action Center and some of their achievements they've had. They've had over the last year or two some pretty significant accomplishments. I mean, I know it's one by one, and they're not world-shaking, but they play a role in building the a more liberal culture.
Right. Well, look, they've worked very hard to counter discrimination against Arab citizens of Israel. There are not a lot of people who care, about equal rights for Israel's Arab citizens. Whenever there's a case or a problem, they go to court. They've had a few victories in that regard. They're very strong defenders of the Bedouin, who are in the southern part of Israel. Another cause that they've been involved with has been, and it was an issue in this election. They've done very good work. They've had some support from the federation, our federation, in Metro West. In this is the whole transportation on Shabbat issue. I mean, it's kind of a strange issue for us in that we believe in observing Shabbat in a liberal way, obviously, but the fact is this is a human issue. First of all, we think people need to make their own choices, and they shouldn't be made by a coercive government policy. But in a country where you still have, in many cases, either a 6-day work week or a 5.5-day work week, you have many people who still do not have cars in Israel. So when they're off, if you have family that you want to visit, how do you visit them? That may seem like a small thing. It's not a small thing. If you're in Israel and you can't afford to have a car, which is very expensive, taxes are very high on transportation.
Touches the lower and middle income.
Very much so, very much so. And so building support for this has been one of our great causes. We don't get a lot of publicity for it. And it's interesting because this is a case where many municipalities, the law as it now stands is such, without getting into the details, that local municipalities can in fact take action here in providing bus service or public transportation, either by paying for it themselves and not charging people for it, or setting up a system where private companies can operate and are permitted to operate by municipalities. The Orthodox, of course, very upset by this, but we've had there's been very substantial progress in the last year or two in providing options for transportation on Shabbat for people who need it in order to see their relatives and meet their obligations and simply have the freedoms that they ought to have, and that are not, we feel, inconsistent with a religious approach to Shabbat.
Very, very humane thing to do. And I want to underscore what Eric said, that there's been direct support of this effort by our Metro West, Greater Metro West Federation, and may I add, by several members of Temple Emanu-El of Westfield who have contributed mightily and financially to this effort and have made a real difference. And Eric, if I can be a little self-serving, I just think back on the 1980s when I was president of ARTSA, you were the director, and we played a little role in in bringing the Israel Religious Action Center into being. Right? It was.
We did. Yes, we did.
It was a great.
Come a long way since then.
It has. It's a great moment then. We've had some great leaders, and Anat Hoffman is doing a marvelous job. And when things settle down, I think it's time to bring Anat back to Westfield. So I want to thank you, Eric, immensely. This was a terrific discussion. My partner, Terry, is sitting next to me, and she says it was great. She was great. And we wish everybody on the call good health. We are going to be meeting next week with Rabbi President at 11 o'clock. And since we may be limited and moving around in the weeks ahead, maybe we'll schedule one or two more. If there's a subject that you would like to see us address after next Monday, send me an email to ravcak@aol.com, ravcak@aol.com. We'd be happy to try to consider subject. We're delighted that we had close to 150 people or so on this call. Quite amazing. Maybe we should do this forever. No, I don't think so. We're looking forward to seeing you all in person in the weeks ahead, off there, whenever it happens. And we wish you good health, safety, and be well. Thank you again, Eric. And thank you, Jackie Gruskop.
Good to be with you.